But one of the things that you've said several times is that you feel like the solution to the meaning crisis doesn't need narrative, or that narrative shouldn't be part of the solution. And so I think that if those two both have their function, let's say, why is it that you want to remove one and keep the other?
No, okay. That's an excellent question.
This is something Sam Harris struggles with too, by the way. No, I'm dead serious about that. I'm dead serious about that.
So let me answer this really carefully and tell me if we're getting too far afield from the main discussion, okay? So I'm going to depend on both of you.
Yeah.
My argument is the nomological order that one of the problems of the meaning crisis is the nomological order that we have is no longer in any way relatable to or can be wedded to a narrative. Because the nomological order we have, right, is that so what used to bridge between the nomological order and the narrative order is teleology. So teleology says the nomological order is ordered, but it's ordered in this way. And the teleology has this structure. And then narrative says, oh, I can glom onto, I can conform to a teleological order because stories are inherently teleological. But they're different from just a teleology. Just telling a teleology isn't a story, but stories can attach to teleology. Is that?
Yeah. Why is describing a teleology not a story? Because you could describe you could describe the cup, but then the problem is well, can you describe the cup in the absence of a narrative? And I mean, I think part of the argument I'm trying to make in this, so this is our key disagreement in some senses. I don't think you can.
Okay.
And so,
well, let's be really careful because we might also be engaged in semantic drift. Mm-hmm. So I'm trying to limit, like we can trivialize what we mean by narrative and mean, any description of a series of events is a narrative. Okay.
Yeah. No, okay. I don't want to do that. I get your point. No, we don't want to widen the words so much that the argument
Wait a minute though, but wait a minute. No, I would actually object to that because any descriptions of events that I can conceive as being one has to have some kind of narrative structure.
Otherwise, we have the problem of infinite
we have the same
perception.
problem of multiplicity and combinatorial exposure. If I can recognize that events connect together,
that opens up. That means that you have to not metaphorically.
I agree with that.
But well, let me challenge it though.
Unfortunately,
and I'm not speaking metaphorically here because if I'm speaking metaphorically, we're just off in another thing. That means that music has a narrative because it has a melody. You're saying a melody is a narrative, and that strikes me as a very improper thing to say.
That's a tough one, man.
Yeah.
Because then you have to start to wrestle with, well, what do you mean by music? Because you could say that the sequence of the notes in and of itself may not have a narrative, although I'm not certain of that, but you could say that but then the question is, when you're listening to the music and it has the effect that you regard as music on you, how much of that effect, including the aesthetic, is a consequence of a narrative? So I would say, well, when you say music, how sure are you that what you're saying is that's nothing but the relationship of the notes to one another?
I agree. That's a good point.
Because there's no embodiment in that, right?
Right. And there's a sense in which music is neither subjective or objective. But
right. Like beauty.
Yes.
But it has to have something that is at least analogous to narrative, because in order for you to recognize, and it's funny because the moderns tried to go away from that. You can understand. The moderns really tried to break it. But there was, in any traditional society, there are tropes of music which help you understand when something's beginning, when something's ending. And
you can map them onto narrative very directly because that's what happens with movies.
Then I slide you because if you give me you say, I'm going to send you narrative to melody, then I'll say, here's a logical argument and there's a progression and a through line from the premises to the conclusion. Is that a narrative?
Well, that's a tough one, right? Because the fact that you selected out those okay. Here's something I've been thinking about. I'm going to take a slight detour, but go right back to the point. So I thought about this more when I was talking to Richard Dawkins, because I think Dawkins is a good faith player, and I think he's a real scientist, and he believes that the truth will set you free, which scientists have to believe to be scientists, because they cannot be scientists if they're not pursuing the truth.
The truth is sacred to Dawkins.
Absolutely.
He won't admit that, but it is.
Okay, so
I'm going to try to connect a few points that were discussed in this conversation, and hopefully it will make sense and be a good, coherent line of thinking. So first is this question of the necessity of a narrative. Now it seems that John Vervaeke was the only one who was really trying to argue that we should try to remove the narrative. Removing the narrative seems extremely difficult. Also, it's difficult to say if things do not have narratives. It's funny to me that the idea that was brought up as an example of something without a narrative was the theory of evolution.
The theory of evolution, right, is not a narrative. It's a description of the way things unfold. Or let's say Newton's laws. Newton's laws are not narrative in any fashion.
The word evolution means change over time. I think it's difficult to argue that there's no such thing as change over time. That seems extremely evident. However, when we talk about evolution, most of the time we're talking about Darwinism, and Darwinism is an idea that is formed within a narrative. Because we would never have known about it if it wasn't for the narrative that Darwin shared. And you could say that The Origin of Species is not a narrative book, but it really is. And even if the book itself is presented in a dry scientific way, it's nested within the narrative of Darwin's life experience, his hypothesis, his testing of the experiments, his journey on the Beagle, his trip to the Galapagos, and looking at those finches and all those things. This is all part of the narrative of Darwin. So part of the narrative is to say that Darwin is an excellent scientist and he followed all these methods correctly, and therefore his findings are good. Then we have, it is hard to deny that the successful spread of Darwinism as a concept was not based nearly so much on self-evident facts as it was on a compelling narrative. And it was salient to people because it lessened the authority of sacred writings on humanity. It freed them from a certain sort of bondage that people imagined having. Whether that was true bondage or not could be debated, because I think it led to worse forms of bondage ultimately. And then out of that, an established set of principles went forth in guiding how experimentation happened. And so, it's very hard to separate the theory of Darwin's theory of evolution from the surroundings of narrative. And even when we convey it to children, it's conveyed as a narrative. And it's conveyed as a mythological narrative, because the narrative that's conveyed in most, and I know this as a science teacher who taught about the theory of evolution from secular science curriculum, it is taught as much as a mythological story is told. There's no photographs of the things that are imagined in the theory of evolution as it's written in science textbooks. So they rely on drawings, illustrations, which are creative works of the imagination. And it's taking a concept and it's crafting a narrative around it. And that's how it's presented to children, with the caveat that they are told that it is unquestionable fact.
the demons. Sent to this world, they would forever be denied bodies of flesh and bone. Those who remained neutral in the battle were cursed to be born with black skin. This is the Mormon explanation for the Negro race. The spirits that fought most valiantly against Lucifer would be born into Mormon families on planet Earth. These would be the lighter-skinned people, or white and delightsome, as the Book of Mormon describes them. Early Mormon prophets taught that Elohim and one of his goddess wives came to earth as Adam and Eve to start the human race. Thousands of years later, Elohim, in human form once again, journeyed to earth from the star-based Koran, this time to have sex with the Virgin Mary, in order to provide Jesus with a physical body.
I didn't teach them that it was unquestionable fact. I told them that it was prevailing theory in the secular culture, but that there are alternative views of that. And, and so they maybe were a little bit more aware of the narrative aspect of it, because I was not trying to hide from them the origins of this theory, the things that have been discovered since then that contradict its validity, and so on. So I thought that was one interesting note. Secondly, the idea that music is also not narrative.
That means that music has a narrative because it has a melody. You're saying a melody is a narrative, and that strikes me as a very improper thing to say.
With which Chad the alcoholic made a nice little video questioning that point, and I would also agree. And as I have talked about a while ago in a video I did about the Tower of Babel, I shared a clip from Rick Beato, who's a music producer, and his son happens to have perfect pitch. And he studied the phenomenon of perfect pitch, and what he came to realize, or what scientists have come to realize, is that perfect pitch is not like a miraculous random thing that just happens to some people, but it is actually it's a learned trait that basically any baby could learn perfect pitch if it was necessary for the formulation of language. And in the case of his son, what he basically figured out is that his son, being in this environment where there was all this music going on, and very complex music, a lot of improvisational jazz and things like Bach and other symphonic music, and just so much variety of music and genres of music and different contexts, that basically what happens to a baby's brain is it's the same way that they decipher language. They just kind of decipher a pattern out of all this stuff they hear. And it's so complicated that we don't even really know how exactly it works. But essentially, out of the greater complexity, the more the more complex it is, the more the harder their brain works to decipher what's going on. And because it's searching for meaning, essentially, the brain finds meaning in the fact that 12 distinct tones are heard over and over again. And this is in Western music. Now, if you introduce some other types of music that have microtonal scales, then the musical vocabulary could be increased even more. But nevertheless, the Western scale has 12 notes in it, and if you and as many and those are absolute pitches. An A is an A, a C is a C. But also, there are many languages that have tonal qualities to them. such as I think Mandarin does, and like Cantonese does even more. You can use the same syllable, but by changing the pitch, you change the meaning. And those people with those languages tend to develop perfect pitch more because it's more crucial to identify pitch, in their understanding. Now, in most of those languages, they only need to identify like a rising pitch or a falling pitch, or there's like a contrast between low and high, etc. So, but if it was absolutely crucial to that language development to learn the absolute pitches, babies could do it. And so, from a scale of 12 notes, if you had just one instance of a high and a low for each note, basically a 2-octave scale, that's 24 notes. 24 notes you could easily map onto the English alphabet. You kick off whatever, like Q and Z or something, or combine those letters a little bit, or you add like a click and a pop. You could teach a version of English that was entirely composed of tones, musical tones, and you could develop a more complex language with sort of musical grammar attached to it. But even just with the tones, those basic tones, you could do it. And so, small phrases of music become words and phrases and sentences and paragraphs, and so the idea that music doesn't have narrative is kind of crazy, because that really is what the baby with perfect pitch is deciphering from the music. And it's interesting because he basically says, like, the kid kind of like every note has like a different feeling to it, and like a different association. So as those associations grow, the child with perfect pitch could very easily craft a narrative that was purely musical. And actually, the first thing that came to my mind was the song "My Ship" by Miles Davis, when he was talking about music not having a narrative. And there's no words in that song, but it very much has it's like, I don't know, a hero's journey kind of shape or something. And I think that a melody is very much the same as a narrative. And I think that, when we use the word narrative, we are meaning it to represent this sort of story element. But, maybe the way that there is a thing that a musical scale or a melody is not exactly the same as a narrative, but they're analogous expressions of a different thing, which I think is expressing meaning through chronological time. And that's like the key of what a narrative is, as opposed to a painting. And a painting that's only one image. When you look at a lot of these icons and things, oftentimes they have a central image, but there are little images around that are giving you the chronological steps. Or like a comic book. You can have a comic book without words, it still has a narrative because you're reading it in a chronological order. And hieroglyphics are, even the earliest version of that. So, I don't think that you can escape the narrative thing without, ultimately. And because I think that is the way that we understand things chronologically through time. We tend to make stories about things. It doesn't mean it has to be fictional. It's the way that we express, how just information. And for instance, in the Sam Harris idea that like a recipe could be interpreted as a biblical text and given sort of significance through that interpretive mode. It's even more possible that you could express the truth of a recipe. Which the truth of a recipe is that you can cook a thing, and you can do that even better through a narrative. And there's many books, children's books, is the most simplest example, where it will be a story of somebody making food, and that's something people do every day. Every day you make your breakfast, you make your lunch, you make your dinner. Hopefully you make at least one of your meals yourself every day. If not, the narrative could be about what the person at the drive-thru does or whatever, But you can turn anything into a narrative. It's often the best way that we have to communicate with people who don't have the exact specific knowledge. As for an example, when somebody asks me what I do for work, I don't just say I'm a lead service technician, because that doesn't mean anything to them. Or even if I said I'm a lead service technician at a cabinet company, that doesn't mean anything. So maybe they get a little bit of a better idea, but or if I just said I work at a cabinet company, depending on what clothes I'm wearing at the time when I say that, they could think that I'm a salesperson, or the person building them, or the person installing them, or somebody who's answering the phones, or whatever. It doesn't tell you anything. But if somebody doesn't have a concept, in narrative words, I can very easily explain to them what I do to the degree that I think it's pertinent for them to understand. And if they happen to have some knowledge of that subject, then it's very easy to share more details and have a very easy communication. But I could also very easily say, I have this and that experience with coworkers, or bosses are always this way, or my commute is such, and none of those things are specific to my job. Those are just things that are they're common to jobs in general. So anybody who has a job could probably relate to some of those things. So anyway, that's a lot of examples of just the narrative thing. It's just, you can't escape it. But yet, John Vervaeke brought up another kind of point in that, and I guess I'll have to brush up on my little, I don't spend a lot of time reading Aristotle or Plato. Maybe that's to my detriment. I took Philosophy 101. I read actually a really great book that teaches the philosophy, some of the history of philosophy through a narrative structure called Sophie's World. It's a very good book. I read it, when I was in high school. Read it a couple times. He seemed to emphasize that it was the return to Plato as opposed to Aristotle that brought mathematics back. And so I don't know if he was laying narrative at the feet of Aristotle. I don't remember exactly. I know Aristotle was more interested in, empiricism, I guess you could say. And I know that Aquinas is really influenced by him with his kind of form and substance talk. But, mathematics as the language of creation, or, the kind of that was what knowledge of mathematics was what was necessary to be a part of the academy, and that is what ushered in and brought about the scientific revolution and modern science. And I think that where this really meets for me is that I've been exploring the concept that science fiction might be, in many ways, one of our best meaning-making tools that we have at our disposal now. And especially, or I would say, and the fact that when you go to a bookstore and they have science fiction and fantasy in one section is very relevant. And in that brings the spiritual aspect that, is also necessary into it. And in these days, the line of distinction between science fiction and fantasy is very blurry, because on the one hand, science fiction doesn't last well. It has an anachronistic quality because you're trying to guess the future. You can be imaginative about anything that's in the future, but either you will reach the time that you described or the technology that you implied, and then it's no longer in the future. Now it's in the current, and it doesn't line up with reality, so then it's not as relevant anymore. So science fiction is kind of like, I don't know, I guess you could say it's like Protestant denominations or church planting. It's by design not designed to be the most permanent thing ever. Whereas fantasy, by focusing on by putting the power not in technological terms, but in, metaphysical, spiritual, magical terms, it has a more timeless quality to it. So, Lord of the Rings is perennial and never going to be, it's always going to hit in the same way. You could say Narnia. The Narnia part of Narnia is always pretty good. It's actually kind of funny because the part that happens in England is very much set in a historic past, and so, it's beyond us. We're beyond that now. But, those are the two that people bring up all the time because they're the Christian guys and they're the Inklings and everybody loves them. And they're great. But I think that the interesting thing is that in the modern fantasy, well, you got to talk about Brandon Sanderson because he's the most popular fantasy author probably ever.
This extra writing time has become very precious to me. Before 2020, I'd begun to let all of these ideas just wither away as there wasn't time for them. I'd begun to think that, as much as I loved the big series, they would consume the rest of my life. So, call this the silver lining of 2020. Life has been tough lately, but it has also restored to me something very precious. And I might have gone a little overboard because I've written 5 extra novels in the last 2 years. Look, I know. Don't roll your eyes at me. You deal with isolation and quarantine in your way. I'll deal with it in mine. We all handle stress differently, okay?
He's probably the best too, and he's fantastic because he knows what makes a good story. Part of that is that he's really good at endings, and he has his endings in mind before he finishes the book. So that's a great combination. But one of the really interesting things that he's kind of known for is his world building concepts, and basically he's very much a proponent of what's called like the hard magic system. And I've talked about this before. And it's basically that if you imagine another world where the people have magic, at some point people are going to try to apply the tools of reason to learn how to understand and evaluate that magic and take it to a scientific approach. Now, in a lot of the older fantasy things, magic was bound up in ritual, and it was always that you must perform all the ritual to have the magic happen. And however dark or not it was, whether it's just that you need certain herbs and gemstones and different types of fire and other substances to make something happen, or if it was, harvesting the energy of corpses and, like blood and stuff like that. Whichever way it was, there's always this sort of thing that the person is performing a ritual, and they're performing all these different parts, and it's impossible to say what each part is doing. Oftentimes there is kind of a thing of they forgot to do this one thing that was seemingly innocuous or whatever, but by forgetting to do that one thing, something horrible goes wrong, and that's your impetus for having a story that adventure ensues because of that horrible mistake. And so that's kind of the problem with the spiritual system that is locked in tradition, is that it doesn't have the tools to deconstruct at all to determine what could be unnecessary or what could be replaced in an alternative way, or how the uses could be expanded by tweaking those parameters. Whereas science is fully open to that, and you use a scientific method, you're tweaking one variable at a time, you just determine what that variable controls, and then you can go from there. So basically, in the Sanderson worlds and the imitators, I would say, there's he's always creating these worlds where people have magic of some form or another, and it's different people, and it could be however they acquire it may change. He has a lot of really unique takes on it, but there is always a sort of a concept that there's something knowable underlying it. In a sense, it could be to say like, well, magic is a gift from God, and God created magic for people to use and to do things, and we need to explore it and understand it so that we can make the best use of it, lest we squander its potential or lord it over the people that don't have access to magic. And of course, those elements do crop up, and that provides some of the antagonists' characters in the stories, is that rootedness in tradition and the propagandistic protection of those traditions to support the entrenched powers and keep the underclass from rising up. So there's that blurriness there. Well, is it magic or is it science? It's kind of both. And I think that we've had many things that scientists told us were impossible until perhaps somebody who didn't have a PhD or wasn't as invested in the system of research discovered that it was possible. Flight comes to mind, and there's certainly other things as well. But what I'm saying here is that the line there is becoming blurry. So in that sense, we can use both of these tools, science fiction and fantasy, as sort of means of discovery to conceptualize different ways that things could work. And even if it's wrong, or even if we know it's fiction, that's not as important. Because honestly, the thing is that many people are walking around with a cartoon idea of Darwinism in their head because they learned about it in middle school science, and they could be totally wrong in all their misunderstandings. They have no knowledge of the innovations in science, the problems that have risen up, nor the solutions to those problems. They're completely unaware, but it doesn't really affect them because they are it's not necessary information for how they run their life. And you could also say the same thing about spirituality. Some people are, getting on Twitter and debating about creeds and the superiority of various Christian doctrines and teachings. And then, there's some other people who just know, oh, I'm supposed to love my neighbor? Okay. And that's how they set off in their life, and they accomplish great things with that limited knowledge. But that's just to say that it doesn't necessarily matter how perfect our sense-making stories are if it's not one that's absolutely central to our own sense-making. But if it is central to our sense-making, then we need to invest in the best stories possible. And Lewis and Tolkien get us pretty far, and they work pretty well for certain people. Lewis, I think, is better because he does have a science fiction series, which culminates in what I think is his best, one of his best, my favorite. Maybe not his best, but maybe, I don't know. It's my favorite. That Hideous Strength. And Paralandra is really good too, and Out of the Silent Planet is not as good, but it's okay. But so he has his feet in both of those buckets, but as I say, those buckets are blending now more and more. And if you look at the way that, like, the MCU, I just recently rewatched the Thor movies in anticipation of going to see the new one in the theater, and like in the Thor 2, it's basically looks like just somebody smashed together Star Wars and Lord of the Rings. It's elves with lasers and spaceships. Like, it's, and you have Thor is like a god of thunder, but thunder is electricity, and the Rainbow Bridge is this technological marvel, and it's just all getting smooshed together. And so if that's the case, you can just be sitting on whatever side of that line you prefer. You want to be for more fantastical science fiction or more scientific fantasy. It doesn't really matter. But I think that is, it's going to be one of the ways forward. And, ultimately it will be the way that a lot of people are making meaning. Even if people are just doing it in terms of escapism, it's very central to their being to have these stories. And I remember, like, a really weird, this was before I even knew there was such a thing as a meaning crisis, but I remember just me and my friends laughing about this because we found this whatever it was in the early days of social media, somebody had shared this story from or it was a link to a forum based on fans of James Cameron's Avatar, one of the worst sci-fi fantasy things. Although it does a very good job, I would say, in blending the distinction between the two. And this forum was all people posting about how they are sad when they wake up from dreaming because they have to realize again that Avatar isn't real and they can't live on whatever the world of Avatar was. And somebody was saying that, listening to the soundtrack all day helps get through the pain. And, this is absurd and silly. I mean, if you saw the SNL skit, the font was papyrus. That they used papyrus for the font on Avatar. Come on. This is not a thing to build your life on. Similarly, Star Wars, people love it. But once you've read Dune and you realize, oh, this is the story that George Lucas didn't want to pay the rights to make, so he just wrote his own knockoff. So when you see people getting all upset because the movie makers changed the canonicity of the story, it's just silly. It's like, that's not a thing to build your life on. Don't build your life on a movie. A movie is made to make money. At least read a book, and so getting off the topic here a little bit, but basically these are the ways that people, make sense of it. And I've said that even, we need to be okay with people misinterpreting the Bible if they're interpreting it in a way that they're excited about. Not in the way that they're excited because it lets them do whatever they want, but if they're seeing things in a way that's not the way the church has traditionally thought of it, not the way that a Sunday school teacher may have thought of it, or the way it's presented in, some tradition, we need to be okay with, that we need that people to be able to apply their imagination to those things, because that is part of what, is their meaning is going to come from. I think that the imaginative aspect of interpreting a story, what you bring to it, even to, and especially maybe even to something like the Bible, is an important part of what makes it meaningful to people. And if it's only what the tradition says it is, first of all, there may be some parts of that tradition that are just bad, but you can't question it, and you can't remove them, so that is a challenge. And secondly, there could be areas that the text itself could apply to that the tradition isn't comfortable communicating. So, we have to be a little bit okay with people going beyond that. I'm not afraid of people making bad interpretations of the Bible if they are doing it from the standpoint of genuinely seeking truth and believing that it is a inspired work of revelation. I think that, that you could say that is the cause of a lot of bad theology in the past, and way too many Protestant denominations. But I think that the ultimate experiment there that happens through that process is good, and it's productive, and I am excited to see more of the influence of other cultures who have been learning and experimenting with having the Bible in their own language for a shorter amount of times, to see what interpretations they bring into it, because hopefully they will map some of their folk knowledge onto it, the way that Christianity has kind of blended and absorbed with Greek thought and Roman thought, European thought over time. And I've talked about stuff like that before. But anyway, so if you're bringing mathematics into narrative, you're going to end up as science fiction. And if you bring spirituality into it as well, then you get into modern fantasy. And I think that is a good place. I think that there's a good place to find meaning. So I'm going to release the essay that I wrote in regards to these things, because it actually kind of hit on a lot of points that was spoken about in that conversation, and hopefully it will lead to some fruitful discussion in the future. Thank you.